Hello, I'm Ali, and we've been taking a trip down memory lane and delving into the Yellow Brick archives and looking through some of the events that we've done in the past. So we thought we'd take you back to 2013 to an annual event we ran in collaboration with our friends over at Hoffy called playARK, a festival of games, story and play. As part of the festival, we ran a day of talks that explored how games, story and play influences new ways of developing creativity and changing behaviours and patterns of attention. The theme of the festival in 2013 was reclaimed and focused on ways in which we could reclaim approaches to learning, living and working through games. This first video is a talk from Tom Armitage, a creative technologist and designer, and he talks about making new things out of things that already exist, mining the readily available and slightly out of date for new surfaces, platforms and materials to design with. We hope you enjoyed the video. Do let us know in the comments and please give us a cheeky like. We will be sharing a few of these archival videos over the next few months, so make sure you subscribe to keep up to date. See you next time.
So, one of the slogans of the Situationist International, the, I suppose, art and political movement that was very prominent in Paris in the 50s and 60s was this: Sous les pavés, la plage, under the paving slabs, the beach, which I tend to read as suggesting underneath formal infrastructure, the formal infrastructure that dictates how to be, is a space to be free and to play, to be unfettered. Because the beach is an inherently social place. It's a place shaped by the people on it rather than by what it dictates they do. It's shaped by what they want to do, and of course it's a malleable surface. The institutions we erect, for good or ill, sit atop another environment. For me, there's a lot of meaning bound up in this, and it speaks to a lot of the things I think are true, especially when it comes to designing toys and games and experiences for the urban environment. I jokingly referred to a toy I was building, which I'm going to show you in a bit, as situationist software a few months ago. But now I've had time to think about this more. Situationism turns out to be a very useful lens to look at this sort of work with. Now, it should be noted, I'm using it as a lens, I'm not using it literally, and Guy Debord would be very cross with me if he felt I was representing his perspective. Very specifically, I'm not considering its political implications, and it is a political and revolutionary framework. But I think I'd like to look at some of the useful ideas as a lens that draws a line through various games and toys I've built that exist within cities and look at how they sit atop or alongside other structures or experiences. Because everything I'm going to show you today has something in common. They're all built out of driftwood. They're all built out of leftovers, leftover information, leftover infrastructure, old technology, open platforms. The driftwood that washes up on the beach of the city and that allows us to build new experiences. And then at the end, I'm going to look at what driftwood, the materials we can build these from, is, and how some of these ideas propounded by the situationists help us understand this work of creating experiences for people in cities. The first digital toy I built around cities was about nearly 6 years ago now, was this. This is the Tower Bridge Twitter bot. I wrote it in 2008 because I worked next door to it. It sits on Twitter and it tells you when it's opening and closing and for what vessel. It is barely software. It is somebody else's data. All this information is published in many places, including the internet. I just scrape it. And then I push it to somebody else's platform, Twitter, via the API. It is 70 lines of code that runs once a minute for the past 6 years. I characterize it as a toy, like a lot of my work, because it's this very small thing and it expresses one idea, nothing else. It's partly entertainment, but not entirely so. And it's also somewhat functional. But it's functional as a byproduct of what it does. I know some cab drivers, for instance, who use it, although it was never my intention to be useful. In building it, as is so often the case when you sit down and make something, it began to reveal several interesting truths. It was actually telling me what it wanted to be. So for starters, it's a very deliberate decision to make it speak in the first person. Why? Well, that's how you talk on Twitter, right? You answer the question, what's happening, or what are you doing, depending on when you joined. I am opening for the MV Dixie Queen. which is passing downstream. It's obvious to me that smart devices or buildings also ought to talk in the first person if they want to hang out with me and others on Twitter. But once it began speaking like this, it illustrated to me how Twitter could be a messaging bus for this sort of thing. It definitely can be, but we would have to make it talk the way we wanted it to. By placing it into the same context as my friends and other services, the bridge told me more than just about its functionality. It becomes a kind of heartbeat for the city, showing me how often it opens and closes, sure, but also letting me imagining all the people who sit queued up waiting to cross it in their car or on their bike, waiting at those blue gates to walk across the side. And even when I couldn't see it, it reminded me that the city I lived in was still working, and it showed me how it worked. So it became curiously evocative, not just for me, but also friends and family. It reminds me that London is there even when I'm here in Cardiff or at my parents' in Cheltenham or overseas. One of my Italian friends always liked seeing it when he went home because it reminded him of the bridge right by his office. It becomes this tiny synecdoche for the whole city. It taps into what situationist Guy Debord described as psychogeography, the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotion and behavior of individuals. Or, to put it more plainly, the relationship between place and our understanding of the world. So I have two small toys I've built in the past couple of years that are more explicitly and deliberately psychogeographic. Ghost Car is a toy I wrote in 2012. It's something I made to see how viscerally I'd react to meeting myself on Foursquare. It's named after the ghost car in a racing game. You can see the high score here. The fastest time on a track is represented as an invisible car in Mario Kart and Ridge Racer. And I wondered what one of those for me would be like. So this is my ghost car. It takes my check-ins from precisely a year ago on Foursquare and then echoes them onto another account today. What this means is I can check into a location and I will see myself from a year ago standing there. Does that make sense? The terms and conditions say I can't imitate other people, but I don't think it stops me imitating myself. So there's me in a present, and then me also in the present brought forward from a year ago. What did I learn from this? This has been running for about a year and a half now. What I learned is you can really viscerally remember 12 months ago. I see old me somewhere and I remember who I was there with. I remember what we did in the pub that night, or what film I saw, or what event I was at. And I remember how sad or happy I was at any point in time. It reminds me of how much I'm attached to places, what my routines look like. And it's so much more visceral to see it on a map, not even see it on a map, be told you were there. On the same platform I entered the data into. It's not just a list of facts, it's the visceral kick of your friend Tom Armitage in the past just checked in here. And it's all made of leftovers, leftover data that I spat into the world a year ago. Somebody else's platform, somebody else's libraries. Other than the admin interface that you set it up with, it's invisible. And then once it's running, you never touch it again. And it's worth noting, once I set this up, I went, shit, I've got to start using Foursquare quite a lot now, because I hadn't used it a lot before. This is the main reason I use Foursquare, so I can kick myself in the nuts in 12 months' time. So this model of virtual copies of me used to explore weird behaviours continues to fascinate me. So I've been making a follow-up. So far I've worked on it for about 2 days, but it's working, which means I can show it to you. So this is Ghost Me. Ghost Me is very similar. But whereas Ghost Car displaces me in time, Ghost Me displaces me in space. It makes a copy of me that inhabits another city and then goes where I might go if I was there. So let's break it down. Again, this is a Foursquare echo machine. It takes check-ins from one account and then bends them a bit and echoes them somewhere else. So I've told it what I think the centre of my life is. And I've decided, because I live in London, that's Trafalgar Square. And then I've also told it what I think the centre of my copy's existence is. So I've chosen Central Park in New York. And critically, I've said it's 5 hours in the past. And then, every time I check in on Foursquare, my software calculates that check-in's position as an offset from my centre and applies that offset to the centre of New York. And then, this is a clever bit, it looks for everything in the same category on Foursquare, so it checks me in somewhere relevant like that. What this means is, I go to one of my favourite coffee shops in Peckham, and then 5 hours later, Ghost Me goes to Toby's estate in Williamsburg, which is one of my favourite coffee shops in New York. and an entire coincidence it chose to go there. See, I'm not lying. And of course, it happens 5 hours now because of the time difference. When I wrote and tested this a lot, I was in a cafe in Edinburgh, and I kept finding all these parallel check-ins in Ontario, which is southern Canada, and I thought this was a terrible bug until I looked at a map and realised that yes, if you go that far north from New York, as you go from London to Edinburgh, you get to Canada. So it's teaching me a lot about relative space, and it also has these weird connotations because it's not very in my control. Sometimes it keeps going to Starbucks all the time. Why would I go there? But when it goes to somewhere I love, or even that I've been before in a country I've visited only a handful of times, it makes me smile. It's a bit like a pet I'm looking after. And it also teaches you things about population density, because of course, lat long is no indicator of anything. London is a very large and dense city, and when you go to New York, which is sort of long and skinny when it comes to Manhattan and then Brooklyn, it doesn't quite map the same way. I have a check-in from Reading Services when I was driving here yesterday, which took me to a New Jersey rest stop. But what it also reminds me is how much I like that city and love the one I live in. It's not being live long, and it still needs some more polishing, so before I can let my friends loose on it. But it's having the kind of psychogeographic punch I wanted it to have. Of course, the situationists had their own way of engineering that psychogeographic punch, what they call dérive, and Nick mentioned it earlier, drift, Debord's process for experiencing the psychogeographic procedure. To put it simply, dérive is an unplanned journey through the city, allowing one to be directed by the architecture and environment. The goal is to experience something entirely new, to expose yourself to what they literally called situations. They were resisting the idea that art was a thing that was handed down and given to us and imposed by the media, imposed as part of the spectacle, and that situations could be engineered whenever. It's not really getting lost as just walking with no particular plan and being shaped by the way the environment impacts your unconscious. Now, Debord would point out that it was necessary to set aside both work and leisure in order to dérive successfully, and you have to commit wholly to it, which I think is really indulgent and time-consuming, and I definitely don't have time for. But I still think it has value at a much smaller scale than Debord advocated. So an earlier project of mine sought to alter and shift participants' relationships with the city they lived in. My friend Tom Taylor and I, in about 2009, noticed a lot of our friends taking similar sorts of photographs on Flickr. Tiny things they'd noticed in the world, not sure if anyone else had seen it, captured for posterity. And we really liked that behaviour, and more importantly, we wanted to see more of it. So we built a tiny, almost game to help people look at the world like this, called Noticings. And we explained it at the time like this. Noticings is a game you play by going slower, by having a look around you. It doesn't require you to change your behaviour significantly or interrupt your routine. You just take photographs of things you think are interesting or things you see. You get points for noticing things, and you might get bonuses for coincidences. The way you played, you just told the website you were playing, and then when you put photographs on Flickr, you tagged them as noticings. And when it launched, there was one rule. You get 10 points for a noticing. Each day at about 3 o'clock, we'd score the previous day's photos, which let our friends in America play. And then slowly, as time went on, we added new rules. Points for being the first person to take a picture in a neighbourhood. Points for your first picture in a neighbourhood. Points for taking a picture of a typo. Points for taking a picture of something red. Points for taking a picture near another noticing, which usually meant you've seen the same thing. Points for taking a picture every lunchtime for a week. And so on. It was a bit like Foursquare. Some of the rules were secret, some not, and they emerged over time. Some ran for a couple of weeks, some for the whole run. So here's a noticing that got points for being a noticing, and also being something lost. How did we know it was lost? The player told it was, and we trusted them. Here's a neighbourhood view, so you can see all the noticings in a particular district of London, and how the scores are calculated. Noticings was played simply by posting a picture to Flickr, which we used their service, and leftover data from players' photographs, lat long embedded in the EXIF. It also used leftover time. It fitted into players' routines, barely changing what they do. For some players, it was just about asking them to add one new tag to what they already did. But then it also encouraged new behaviour through the new rules, and also just through the way it required you see the world. Sometimes it encouraged new behaviour simply because people were enjoying it. Why did I go out with my bike in this weather? For points on noticings, feel silly and soaked and pray my front wheel's safe from thieves. It also cultivated a bit of dérive in the day. Not wholehearted commitment like Debord wanted, but just enough. Drifting off in the middle of daily routine, or changing routine and making pilgrimages like this. So it's kind of exciting and also weird that we made somebody get very wet and nearly get their bike nicked. But I'm also glad they were enjoying it. And 15 months later, we turned it off. We didn't have the time to make it as good as it could be, and Tom and I had both got new jobs, and it was all a bit tiring, and we closed it. But people still use the noticing tags. And our friends still use that word to describe a particular kind of seeing. There's this funny, lasting impact. And if you look at how people use Instagram, which came out long after this, yes, it's a social camera. Often it's just snaps of my mates or gigs. But so many people use it as this tiny little Martin Parr app where they just collect weird things they've seen. Lots of people are noticing, even without our game. So I think we were onto something with the behavior. What was most important was not the points, just that people performed the act. And the fact they still are makes me very happy. So it's interesting for me to look back on this body of work when I consider the final project I'm going to show you, perhaps the largest project I'm going to talk about today. Because it takes a lot of these impulses, the psychogeographic act of creating situations, the act of dérive, the use of leftovers, the barely game, and pieces them together to create a new kind of interaction that played out in the city. Hello Lamppost was a project I built with Pan Studio and Georgi Galek. We entered it as a pitch for the inaugural Playable City competition in Bristol, which was organised by Watershed, the arts organisation there, and we won, which meant from about January we had to invent a thing. It ran this summer for 2 months, and it touches on all those things I've previously discussed, and I'm going to talk about it in more detail for most of the rest of my talk. So what was the brief? Watershed defined a playable city as a city where people, hospitality and openness are key, enabling its residents and visitors to reconfigure and rewrite its services, places and stories. It is a place where there is permission to be playful in public. It's a city built on the beach, not the paving stones. This is human, playful and gentle, very much the opposite of ideals about clarity, accuracy, integration, efficiency and refinement, all ideals that emerge in the prevailing rhetoric around the smart city. It's worth noting too, whilst we're talking about the situationists, that one of the great things they were resisting was the planned city, Haussmann's re-architecture of Paris in the 19th century around a plan and a city that conformed to it. He planted fully grown trees into the boulevards so it would look right from the get-go. But cities are made of people, and people cannot be planned. Cities require space to be organic and grow, be it their mess of streets or their buildings or their trees. And that very much ties into the shape of the work as I began to look at it today, these situationist ideals. Anyway, hello Lamppost. When we were developing ideas, a core theme kept emerging, memory and its relationship with location. Sam describes it quite elegantly, this psychogeographical ideal. He said, the city is a diary you can walk through. As you wander around it, you remember places you've been and things you can see. We wanted other people to see the city in this way, and more to the point, share those experiences with the rest of their city. If we were to make all of Bristol playable, it had to be applicable to everybody there. We had to make that psychogeography a little more visible. And we wanted to do this in the most accessible way we could, because it's a brief for the whole city, for the most people at the largest scale. I've worked around ARG-like things, if you've encountered them before, and being honest, it is not that hard to create a cool experience for a few hundred people that's not brilliant value for money, that you do for love, not profit. Like, there are lots of ARGs in the world. 200 people have had a really incredible time with them. It's wonderful. I'm really pleased about that. We were thinking about thousands, maybe tens of thousands. So we had to make something way more immediate. It couldn't involve too much direct intervention from us. It couldn't involve actors. It couldn't really involve plot. It had to be about behavior, something very simple. And it had to be super accessible. So an app for a smartphone might be cool and have GPS and maybe augmented reality, and all of a sudden 10% of the people I know can play it, because that 10% have a smartphone and the enthusiasm to download an app just based on a poster they saw. But everybody understands text messaging. Every mobile phone has SMS. And it's ridiculously simple to implement now. If you can build a web page, you can build text message or telephony-based applications. We use a service called Twilio. They were great to us. I will let you check them out. If you want to make things with SMS, it does make it easy. I'm not even advertising. It's just joyfully easy. It's a superficially unexciting technology, and it was made super simple by web-based services. They took this massive leftover, the fact that there is network time available, spoke to a lot of phone companies around the world, and then just gave it to me to write services with, or you. It's another leftover. So secondly, we've got that accessibility of the technology that kids and grandparents can use because everyone has a mobile phone with SMS. And then we also wanted to use as much of the city as possible without incurring too many costs. So we had to use what was there. We didn't want to just gate this to a tiny area of town. We wanted to find a way of hijacking the existing infrastructure. So we spent a lot of the time scouring the city for opportunities. And we noticed that a lot of street furniture, lampposts, post boxes, bus stops, cranes, bridges, have unique reference and maintenance labels. We thought it would be interesting for these objects to be intervention points, something more tangible than GPS and very commonplace. Just tell us where you are. At the time, I jokingly said the smart city uses technology and systems to work out what its citizens are doing. The playable city just says, where are you? What we ended up was a playful dialogue where you could text message street furniture, hold a dialogue with it, or rather be interviewed by it, and then find out what other people would be saying. It's a short film that basically explains this. The end results look like this. You greet an object with our formulaic greeting, hello object type #code, and then you just do what it says. You talk to it, it asks you some questions, it knows what the weather is, it knows what time of day it is, and it'll sometimes let you know what other people have said to it, or one of its friends, other objects of the same type. We really front-loaded the experience. We had to make that first conversation as good as it could be. Again, I've learnt time and time again, it's very frustrating putting loads of cool content at the end of the experience and not at the beginning. Because when you say to somebody, it's really cool if you spend 5 days with it, you're kind of failing. We decided that if you played with it, that was awesome, and if you played with it more than once, that was even more awesome. And as you can see, you're interviewed by the object. It tells you about other responses. If you keep talking to the same object, the game does change with you. The more you talk to it, the more intimate it gets, the more friendly it gets. And it would begin to ask you about memories and points of view. The intensity grows as familiarity grows. It provides an incentive to talk to the same object. What did we envisage there? Talking to the post box at the end of your road, talking to the bus stop that you go from every day, building a little situation, a ritual about talking to street furniture. A friend of mine who worked there would tell me excitedly when he saw somebody wandering through the town and just pulling out their phone and staring at a bus stop like this. It made me very happy. We'd created a very strange new little interaction. And to induct people into the idea, we needed to make it very legible. It's a fundamentally invisible system otherwise. Watershed helped us a lot with the advertising campaign. We had these banners. We had 4 here. We had some billboards by the motorway. We had some things on the cranes. We had one thing on a bridge. And they were all unique because they all had a unique code on them. They were the entire instructions to the game. Text, hello lamppost, #HR84 to talk to me. And off you go. It was very satisfying that you could fit the entire instructions to play on all the display advertising. There was no downloading an app. Now, the majority of players would, in fact, interact with these first, so we worked hard to make sure that it would say, you do know you can talk to things that aren't covered in yellow posters. It'll work with anything. And many of them would then go on to play with the rest of the city. But it was really important to give that invisible system form. So in the 2-month run, because it only ran for 8 weeks, we engaged about 4,000 players, i.e. 4,000 people played it, who had just under 10,000 conversations, speaking with over 1,000 unique objects, sending about 25,000 text messages our way. And you can see that the breakdown of objects, everyone liked talking to lampposts because it was called Hello Lamppost, but we were also spread fairly evenly amongst other street furniture objects, post boxes, telegraph poles, parking meters. Bridges feature heavily because there was a very prominent bridge we'd got some advertising on. And interestingly, there were 80 statues of Gromit from Wallace and Gromit in Bristol for the summer, and quite a lot of people talked to them, which was strange because we all know Gromit never says anything, but they all tried. But the numbers are just me proving that people did really play it. This was not what was most important. What was most important was what people said, what they were sharing about their Bristol with others, what those moments of ritual we were creating are. From the poetic, if you listen carefully, what's the quietest thing you can hear? Fingers clenched to moving parasols. To the local and the personal, what's your favourite memory of Bristol? Taking my son to see the balloons take off at Ashton Court Balloon Fiesta for the first time. He was 4 years old. Come back, balloons, I love you. And of course, because the way the game worked, other people would see these responses too on their phones. And of course, particular objects would ask very specific questions about themselves, which would lead to great answers. If I could be yours, said the billboard, for the day, what would you write on me? I think I'd write, be excellent to one another. And of course, as people played, we displayed their quotations on the project website, which is at hellolamppost.co.uk, it's still there. What was great was to see how people were engaging with the city and with us, because these quotations were not the pick of the crop. People just started talking to it in the way we hoped they would from the get-go. Now that I look back on it, I can see that Hello Lamppost acts as a lovely summation of 5 years of toys and games built around cities. It's an experience that doesn't so much interrupt your experience of the city as it layers on top of it, letting you see the paving and the beach all at once. It builds ritual and new interactions into routine. It requires almost nothing to engage with it. And most of the systems it uses, SMS, Twilio, the city, are all built by other people. We just built this middle layer, which is fairly complex, but it's still not everything. What can we learn from all this? By building on top of other services, we create a kind of sustainability. When Noticing's closed, all the photos were still on Flickr. They just had a new tag on them. If my ghost bots break, their activity is still on Foursquare. It's preserved forever. We don't destroy the value we've created the second we turn it off, which is more like how a city behaves. It degrades or is reused or is gentrified. History becomes another layer of patina on top of it. It isn't torn down instantly. Again, I always come back to Stuart Brand's diagram of how fast the layers of a building move in How Buildings Learn, which has been just a fundamental book about general design for me. We're not planting fully grown trees and then tearing them out again. We're building an ecosystem, and perhaps other games or tools will build on top of us. It's sad that Hello Lamppost had to end. We hoped, once people twigged how it worked, they might start drawing codes on their street art or adding it to their posters in order to leave messages on advertisements for gigs. If the city's a beach, then it's littered in driftwood. And when I think of driftwood, I think about flotsam and jetsam. So flotsam is that which just floats ashore naturally of its own accord and bobs around. Jetsam is that which you throw off the top of a boat to lose weight. It's deliberately put into the sea. And I think those categories apply to the materials I think of as driftwood. I genuinely believe these things are materials, just like wood or steel. I mean, that might be obvious with regards to some of them, but not all. If a material is something we manipulate and shape as a designer, then all these things are materials. Think about the jetsam, the things we're given. Services and infrastructures, like Twitter and Foursquare, or more tactile services, like transit networks and the maintenance codes on objects. What about all the technology which is now basically left over to us? SMS and telephony, but also things like print on demand. That's fundamentally old technology that's just now become cheap enough to basically give to you for a few dollars. These things have become commoditized and tossed overboard, and they're made available to all. And because we don't have to build them, we can spend our time working on the unique experiences and interactions rather than the underlying platforms. And then there's what's already bobbing around. There's data. The city is drowning in data. I tend to describe data as an exhaust because you give it off whether you like it or not, and it follows you around like a cloud. People give it off, machines give it off, and systems give it off. Some of that we do by choice. We check in on Foursquare or say where we are on Twitter or go to a Facebook event, tell Eventbrite or Lanyard we're going to an event or conference. buy a gig ticket on Starbreeze, check in on Songkick. But then there's all the stuff we don't have a choice about, our travel card usage, our loyalty card usage in the supermarket, what we bought where. This is all there, frequently, that you can get at with the end user's permission, and it can lead to unusual new ambient interactions. What are the environments you can repurpose? Not just the city as a whole, but smaller spaces, institutions, establishments, public spaces, parks, transit networks. All of these are spaces and contexts to build within, and they all come with their own affordances. Even when they're controlled or marshalled by others, they are spaces to consider reclaiming and repurposing. And just as we can reclaim space, consider time as a material to be reclaimed too. What are the points of the day we can design for? Not just active 100% concentration, I am playing a game, but all those elements where there's surplus attention. We can't create Debord's focused, committed day-reeve, but how can we create a tiny fragment of it, a new little ritual, without invading the daily routines that it's critical we maintain? Because this isn't the city I know. This is not more London, this is less London. More London is this big bit of space down by the City Hall on the South Bank. I don't know if you know about it. And it looks like the South Bank, and it's got lots of signs on it saying, this is not public space, but you're allowed to be here because we're being nice. Don't do anything. You know it's not public because it stops behaving like a city. It's doing everything in its power to resist the beach it sits upon. But I don't think the city can resist the beach it sits upon, because there are so many things we can build on top of it, be it on these semi-public, semi-private, corporatized spaces, or the genuine publics throughout the city. And to build and make them, we don't even need to invent architectures and infrastructures. We don't have to make it obvious they're happening. We can use what's already there. We can make new experiences out of the driftwood that lives across the city and across the network. And we can lift up the paving slabs and reveal the beach underneath. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Does anybody have any questions while we've got some time? Yes. Is that Lizzie? Yes.
With the Hello Lamppost project,
Yes.
do you have a map of Bristol that shows which neighbourhoods were hot for it and which were not?
I have to talk into a microphone. Not quite, because there's an unfortunate problem with it, which is that whole thing where we chose not to use GPS means we chose not to use GPS. And when you say to the town council, in all the codes, just run all your lampposts, do you have a list of them? They all say, nah. We do have one map. We have a map of post boxes, because post box codes are geographic. They are basically a postal code. And we have a rough heat map of that. What I can tell you, it's nicely distributed. It's not all centred around the centre. It's not all centred around affluent areas. I mean, it does focus on the very centre of the city. It was very deliberate that it was playable both in the suburbs and in the town. We play tested it out of the city in poor areas, in trendier areas. We didn't just focus on a very middle-class urban experience. And we hoped it would be, again, because we were using this simple technology, it would work like that. Although I can tell you a lesson about testing SMS games. The good news that came out of this was a 12-year-old told me I was cool, which was really awesome. But the number of times I take this to places and we go, we're testing a game, could you bring your phone? Everyone turns up with their phone, and you sit down and you say, so what you're going to do is you're going to go into the city and you're going to text a thing, and a hand goes up. And this hand has gone up from an 11-year-old girl, and it has gone up from a 32-year-old media worker, and they both asked the same question, which is, do we need credit for this? Which is a very interesting question when you consider, again, that some people's relationships to this device is financial. It's not 20 quid a month and I just use it as much as I want. It is literally like feeding the meter with coins. So actually, that fed into things like keeping the conversation length down, because when I made it 3 questions longer, it was costing you £1 if you were paying 10p a message, which we didn't want to do. So we do, but it's quite vague, because in some senses we went for this deliberately holistic, not locational thing. The post boxes do help prove that it wasn't just 4 post boxes in the middle of town by central location, but it was distributed. I don't have that map to hand. But in terms of the thinking about what we would like that map to look like, yes, it was deliberately designed to appeal to the different types of terrain in that particular city. Does that help answer your question a bit?
Was there another question? Yes.
Where are we going?
Can you just wait for the microphone?
Where are we going?
The Lady Rosie? The Lady Rosie.
The Lady Rosie.
Rosie.
Hello, the Lady
Hello, Lady Rosie.
There you go, the Lady Rosie.
Uh-oh. Hello.
Hi, Tom. My question is around the interaction in Hello Lamppost and why you decided to go for like an interview rather than something more gamey or something kind of a little bit more...
I thought about something more gamey. We came down to, I think we wanted to be conversational, we wanted to be a little bit ambient, because I think we were mainly interested in what people had to say, rather than some kind of metric. I certainly resonated with the idea that a playful city doesn't necessarily involve games, it involves play-like experiences. Some of the things that are in the way the interaction ended up are very deliberate, in that they corral the player into behaving nicely. When we offered them more choice, or when we used sloppier language, they tended to have more disappointing experiences because it would not respond to them and it wouldn't pay attention to them. I wanted to come up with something that felt good every time you did it, and we actually got the language to the point where in the final playtest I don't know if you were at the first one, but the first one was, everyone hated it, and they said, it's not listening to me and it's ignoring me and it keeps talking nonsense at me. And in the final one, people just laughed because somehow we'd got that cold reading right. I think it was almost a way of turning the city inward. I didn't want to leave a thing that, in some ways, then when we left, the game had gone, and what was there left to do? You can't talk to the objects anymore, but you can still consider the stories that are left there. It's kind of a hard question to answer, because we did look around it, but I think we were all interested in something game-like, but not gameful. I like games. If someone comes up to me in the street and says, do you want to play a game? I tend to go, no, go away. Whereas if I got to choose, I would like that more. And I think something more game-like, in my mind, might have limited the audience I could have got a widespread appeal for. In a 2-month run as well, that means it's quite hard to build up critical momentum. If it was a much longer project, I think something which we had scope to change and manipulate over time, a game where the rules develop or there's space to develop expertise, might be good. It was, in some ways, we were also designing around the brief and the constraints, and we felt the best way to meet those constraints of, really, once it's running, we have to leave it. We can't attend to it for various reasons. We couldn't attend to it for 56 days for 4 of us by hand. So what would be a more ambient thing we could leave? And it began to be something that was a bit more self-policing, a bit more self-generated. Does that help at all? Is that a fair answer? Or do you want to pin me down later and say, but why? Okay. Yeah, totally. So one thing that we did do, and it doesn't quite come through as well in this, and Sam was really keen on this, and I think it was a great idea, and it sort of fell a bit by the wayside in terms of polishing and delivering something good. We liked the idea you could invent games on top of this. When it began, one of the things the objects would just go is they go, finally, is there anything you want to tell me? Because our idea was you could use it as a dead letterbox or some kind of drop. This means that if you wanted to tell a story on top of it or invent a game on top of it, you could, and you could tell your friends how to play it. And it would be more like the platform I described. Actually, in reality, we discovered people hated that question, and there was no real way to do this formalized experience and then go, by the way, do you want to scrawl any graffiti on me? It didn't fit the experience. But yeah, early versions, we were much more leaning towards, there were games to be played, but we wouldn't tell you what they were. You could have hijacked them and made your own if you'd wanted to. That became a lot harder, but I think the experience became a lot more satisfying for the players, who we still call players. You know, they're not really playing much. I mean, they're not playing a game, but they are playing in a way. We went back and forth on this, and I think it came down to the realities of polishing and implementation detail, as opposed to the great big picture at the beginning, which definitely had lots of stuff about, it's more like a platform to play atop this infrastructure we have. And if it's not just a game, there could be many games. And then the reality was this more qualitative, discursive thing about making voices stand out. If you ever spoke to any of the bus stops around the train station, it was really good, because it was full of people either coming back from London or going to London, being grumpy about having to leave their kids or having had 12 hours somewhere out of town. And for me, for that almost first draft or a simple two-month project we ended up with, I think I'm okay with that. There's definitely an opportunity there you're describing, and we couldn't find a way to quite make it fit, so we scaled it back.
Cool, okay. Thank you very much, Tom. Can you give Tom a massive round of applause?